Commander Vecthar had seen war for 300 years and he thought he understood everything about it. But he was wrong about that, and he would learn this truth in the most terrible way possible when he met the humans for the first time in his long military career. The Galactic Coalition controlled most of the known universe, and they had rules about everything, especially about war, because civilized species did not fight like animals, and they did not kill without reason, and they always accepted surrender when it was offered to them by the enemy. Forces Vecthar belonged to the Zephalon Empire, and his people were proud warriors who had helped create the coalition thousands of years ago, and they believed in honor and discipline, and following the ancient codes that kept the galaxy from descending into chaos and total destruction. When Earth requested membership in the coalition, the Council assigned Vecthar to observe their military capabilities and determine if humans were civilized enough to join the Great Alliance of Star Nations, and he accepted this duty with his usual professional attitude. The first human he met was Ambassador Lisa Morgan, and she was a small woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through him, and she spoke about peace and cooperation and Earth's desire to learn from the older species. In the galaxy, Vecthar read the reports about Earth and learned that humans had only recently achieved unity on their planet after thousands of years of fighting each other in brutal conflicts that nearly destroyed their entire civilization multiple times throughout their violent history. The humans had split the atom and created weapons that could burn entire cities, and they had used these weapons on each other during something they called the Second World War, and Vecthar found this disturbing, but assumed they had evolved beyond such barbarism. By now, Captain Jake Hamilton commanded Earth's first deep space vessel, and he seemed friendly and casual in a way that made the more traditional coalition officers uncomfortable with his informal manner and constant questions about how the coalition conducted military operations. His second officer was Lieutenant Susan Price, and she impressed Vecthar with her tactical knowledge, even though she asked strange questions about why the coalition fought in certain ways, and why they did not pursue fleeing enemies to complete destruction of their forces. The humans seemed eager to please and willing to learn, and Vecthar thought they would make acceptable junior members of the coalition once they understood how civilized warfare was supposed to be conducted between intelligent species who respected each other. Everything changed when the Krynoth swarm emerged from the darkness between stars and began attacking the outer colonies with a ferocity that the coalition had not seen in generations of peaceful expansion across the galaxy. The Krynoth were an insectoid race that the coalition had fought before and forced into hibernation after a brief war centuries ago, and they had assumed the species had learned their lesson about challenging the might of the United Galactic Powers, but the Krynoth had only been sleeping and growing their numbers in the dark spaces, and now they returned with thousands of bioships that moved like a plague of locusts, consuming everything in their path across multiple star systems. The coalition mobilized their fleets with confidence because they had superior technology and greater numbers and centuries of military tradition that had never failed them in any major conflict since the formation of their alliance. Vecthar commanded a battle group of 50 vessels, and he prepared to engage the Krynoth, according to standard protocols that had been refined over millennia of warfare between civilized species who understood the rules of engagement. He recommended that Earth's forces remain in reserve because this was not their fight yet, and their ships were untested against a real enemy, and he did not want to risk human lives unnecessarily in their first real combat situation. Ambassador Morgan agreed with this assessment, but Captain Hamilton requested permission to send one ship as an observer unit to learn from the coalition's superior tactics and gain experience that would help Earth defend itself in the future. Vecthar approved the request against his better judgment because he saw no harm in letting the humans watch from a safe distance, as the coalition demonstrated the proper way to conduct a military campaign against an inferior enemy force. The human ship was called EDF Defiance, and it was a small vessel compared to the massive coalition dreadnoughts, but it bristled with weapons that seemed excessive for a ship of its size, and Vecthar wondered why humans felt the need for so much firepower as they prepared to jump into hyperspace toward the embattled colony of New Carthage. Vecthar reviewed the standard engagement protocols with Captain Hamilton and explained how the coalition minimized casualties and always offered the enemy a chance to surrender before destroying them. Hamilton listened carefully and nodded at all the right moments, But something in his eyes made Vecthar uneasy in a way he could not quite explain, and it reminded him of predators he had seen on various planets evaluating their prey before the kill. The captain asked if the Krynoth had ever accepted surrender in their previous conflicts, and Vecthar admitted that they had not, but explained that offering the option was a matter of principle that separated civilized species from mindless animals. Hamilton smiled, but the expression did not reach his eyes, and he thanked Vecthar for the briefing and returned to his ship to prepare his crew for their first observation of a real space battle between major military powers. Lieutenant Price contacted Vecthar privately and asked what the Coalition protocols were for enemies who deliberately targeted civilians and consumed sentient beings for biological resources, and he was surprised by the specific nature of her question. He explained that such behavior would be considered a war crime and would result in harsher terms of surrender. But the Coalition always maintained moral superiority by not descending to the enemy's level of barbarism, no matter how provoked they might be. Price thanked him for the information, and her face remained neutral. But Vecthar detected something in her voice that he could not identify, and it made him wonder what the humans were really thinking about the coming battle. The fleet jumped into hyperspace, and Vecthar felt the familiar sensation of reality bending around his ship as they crossed vast distances in moments, and he reviewed his battle plans one final time before they arrived at New Carthage. He had fought in hundreds of battles and commanded thousands of warriors, and he believed he understood everything there was to know about warfare and strategy, and the art of defeating an enemy while maintaining honor and dignity. But Commander Vecthar was about to learn that he knew nothing at all about war, and that humanity had spent thousands of years perfecting something far more terrible than anything the galaxy had ever seen before. The Coalition fleet emerged from hyperspace into absolute chaos, and Vecthar immediately knew that something was terribly wrong, because the Krynoth were not fighting like they had in the previous war, and they were not following any recognizable patterns of military behavior. New Carthage was burning, and the colony's orbital stations were torn apart like paper, and thousands of bioships swarmed across the system like a living nightmare that consumed everything in their path without mercy or hesitation. Vecthar ordered his fleet into standard battle formation, and they began engaging the Krynoth with measured volleys designed to disable enemy ships while minimizing collateral damage to the colony infrastructure and civilian vessels trying to evacuate. The Coalition ships fired with precision, and their weapons were powerful, but the Krynoth adapted to every tactic within minutes, and their bioships regenerated damage almost as fast as it was inflicted upon them by the superior technology. He opened communication channels and broadcast surrender terms in 17 different languages, including the Krynoth's own clicking speech patterns, but they ignored every attempt at negotiation and continued their assault without any sign of rational thought. The Krynoth deliberately targeted evacuation ships, and Vecthar watched in horror as they consumed the survivors to fuel their organic vessels and create more warriors from the biomass of innocent civilians who had done nothing to deserve such a fate. This violated every principle of civilized warfare, and Vecthar realized that the enemy was not interested in territory or resources or any logical military objective, and they simply wanted to consume every living thing they encountered in the system. His fleet was losing, and ships began to fall as the Krynoth overwhelmed their defensive positions with sheer numbers and suicidal tactics that no sane military commander would ever employ against a superior force. Vecthar made the hardest decision of his 300-year career and ordered a tactical withdrawal, because staying would only result in the destruction of his entire battle group, and that would leave other colonies defenseless against. The swarm captain Hamilton's voice came across the command channel and requested permission to engage the enemy, and Vecthar was desperate enough to grant it, even though he expected the small human vessel to provide covering fire for the retreat. EDF Defiance did not retreat, and instead it accelerated directly into the thickest concentration of Krynoth ships, where dozens of biocruisers were tearing apart a Coalition dreadnought, and Vecthar thought the humans had gone insane. Lieutenant Price's voice was cold and mechanical as she called out targeting solutions with an efficiency that seemed inhuman, and the weapons fire from the Defiance came in patterns that Vecthar had never seen in 3 centuries of military service. The human weapons did not disable enemy ships, and they did not attempt to minimize damage, and instead, They obliterated every target so completely that the debris fields became hazardous to navigation for other vessels in the combat zone. Captain Hamilton's face appeared on Vecthar's view screen, and the friendly, casual demeanor was completely gone, and replaced by something ancient and terrible that lived behind his eyes like a caged predator finally released. He spoke 3 words that would haunt Vecthar for the rest of his life, and those words were weapons-free defiance. And suddenly the human ship transformed into an instrument of pure destruction, unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. The Defiance tore through the Krynoth formation, like a blade through flesh, and their weapons created explosions that vaporized bioships and sent shockwaves through the enemy formation, disrupting their coordination and causing chaos in their ranks. When a massive Krynoth biocruiser attempted to ram the human vessel, Hamilton did not evade, and instead the Defiance's hull split open to reveal hidden launch bays that released dozens of attack drones that moved with frightening speed. Each drone latched onto the Krynoth vessel and detonated, with enough force to rip the biocruiser apart from the inside, and Vecthar realized the humans had designed weapons specifically to cause maximum trauma and suffering to their enemies. He pulled up Earth's military files and began reading with trembling hands about human history, and what he found terrified him more than the Krynoth swarm. Because humans had done these things to each other for thousands of years. 2 world wars that killed hundreds of millions, and nuclear weapons that burned cities, and chemical warfare that poisoned entire battlefields, and genocides that attempted to erase entire populations from existence, and somehow humanity had survived all of it. The Coalition had no equivalent to this kind of warfare, and their conflicts were like chess matches played by civilized opponents who respected each other and followed rules that made sense to rational beings. Humanity's wars were not chess matches, and they were more like natural disasters that consumed everything in their path and left nothing but ash and ruins and traumatized survivors who would never forget what they had witnessed. The Krynoth command ship emerged from behind New Carthage's moon, and it was a massive organic construct, 3 times larger than any Coalition dreadnought and covered in weapons that could level continents with sustained bombardment. Vecthar ordered what remained of his fleet to retreat immediately because the battle was lost, and there was no shame in surviving to fight another day against an enemy that could not be reasoned with or defeated by conventional tactics. But Captain Hamilton requested the coordinates of the colony's surviving civilian shelters, and then he plotted a course that would take the Defiance directly between the Krynoth command ship and the planet where millions of innocent people were hiding. Vecthar realized what the human was planning, and he tried to order Hamilton to retreat, but the captain had already cut communication and committed his ship to a course that could only end in death or glory. The command ship ignored the small human vessel and continued toward New Carthage because the Krynoth wanted to harvest the remaining population, and the Defiance seemed insignificant compared to the prize of millions of lives. Hamilton had counted on this, and what Vecthar initially thought was a suicide run revealed itself as something far more calculated and ruthless when the human captain detonated his retreat path. The Defiance had been laying mines as it advanced through the Krynoth formation, and these were not the clean, precise weapons of Coalition warfare, but something humans called hellfire clusters that created overlapping fields of destruction. The explosion lit up the entire star system and would have been visible from 3 systems away, and Vecthar's sensors overloaded trying to measure the energy release from hundreds of weapons detonating in a coordinated pattern. The Krynoth command ship survived because its organic armor regenerated almost as quickly as it was damaged, and Vecthar prepared to witness the destruction of the human vessel and the fall of New Carthage. Lieutenant Price calmly reported that Phase 2 was initiated, and Vecthar detected dozens of small objects accelerating from the debris field toward the command ship, and he could not believe what his sensors were telling him. They were nuclear weapons, and the humans had seeded the minefield with thermonuclear devices that had been banned by the Coalition for thousands of years as barbaric and excessive and fundamentally incompatible with civilized warfare. The Krynoth command ship's hull cracked and burned under sustained atomic bombardment, and its organic armor could not regenerate fast enough to survive the cascade of nuclear explosions that consumed it like a star-going supernova. Vecthar understood in that moment why the Coalition had banned such weapons, because this was not warfare, And it was Apocalypse, and the humans wielded it with the casual efficiency of species that had nearly destroyed themselves multiple times. The Kreenoth swarm faltered without their command structure, and the individual bioships began operating independently, without coordination, and the coalition fleet rallied and pressed their advantage against the suddenly vulnerable enemy. Ambassador Morgan's voice came through on a priority channel, and her tone was apologetic but firm as she explained that Earth had withheld certain military capabilities during their application process to join the coalition. She said that humans did not fight wars like the coalition fought wars, and that humanity fought for survival. And when survival was at stake, they fought with everything they had without restraint or mercy or hesitation. Vecthar watched as more human ships emerged from hyperspace, and their names spoke to a philosophy of warfare that terrified him, because they were called things like relentless and vendetta and last stand. These were not peacekeepers, and they were weapons of extinction held in check only by their own choice to remain civilized. And Vecthar realized the galaxy had been fortunate that humanity had spent so long fighting themselves. The human fleet moved through the Kreenoth swarm like predators that had been hunting together for millions of years, and their coordination was perfect, and their tactics were ruthless, and Vecthar could not look away even though he wanted to captain. Hamilton commanded the Defiance with cold precision, and he communicated with the other human vessels using military terminology that was efficient and brutal and made no allowance for mercy or hesitation in the face of the enemy. The EDF Relentless joined the Defiance in a flanking maneuver that cut through a Kreenoth subformation and destroyed 17 bioships in under 2 minutes, and Vecthar's tactical computers could barely track the speed of their assault. Lieutenant Price distributed targeting data across the entire human fleet, and every ship fired in perfect synchronization to maximize damage and minimize waste. And the Kreenoth had no defense against this level of coordinated destruction. The humans moved like a pack of predators, isolating and destroying Kreenoth vessels with an efficiency that came from thousands of years of practicing warfare on each other. Before they ever left their planet to join the galactic community, there was no offer of surrender and no attempt at communication, and the humans had assessed the threat and responded with total war, and Vecthar realized they had made this decision in seconds, while the coalition had spent hours debating protocol. On New Carthage below, Sergeant Danny Cooper led a ground defense that defied everything Vecthar understood about infantry tactics and proper military procedure. Because the human Marines did not fight defensively like civilized soldiers, coalition ground forces held positions and protected civilians and waited for support from orbital bombardment. But the humans charged directly at Kreenoth landing forces using weapons designed to maximize trauma rather than achieve clean kills. They used flamethrowers that burned the insectoid warriors, alive and explosive rounds that tore bodies apart, and chemical agents that dissolved organic matter. And these were tools of horror that belonged in nightmares, not on a battlefield. Yet the humans were also evacuating civilians with desperate efficiency, and they often sacrificed themselves to save people they had never met and would never know, because they believed some things were worth dying for. Corporal Amy Foster gave her life holding a narrow corridor against 50 Kreenoth warriors, and she bought 3 minutes for 200 colonists to escape, and she used every weapon she had, including her own body, as a final explosive device. Private Chris Murphy carried wounded children through enemy fire and took 17 hits that should have killed him 3 times over, but he kept moving until every child was safe, and then he collapsed and died, with a smile on his face. Vecthar watched this happen through drone footage, and he could not reconcile what he was seeing, because humans were equally capable of infinite compassion and absolute brutality, and they often displayed both qualities simultaneously. They would die to save a single child, and then turn around and incinerate an entire enemy battalion without hesitation, and this duality was their strength and their terror, and it made them unlike any species in the galaxy. The battle began to turn as the Kreenoth lost cohesion, and the human fleet pressed their advantage with relentless aggression, and the coalition forces followed their lead. Even though many officers were disturbed by the brutal tactics, Captain Hamilton coordinated with the coalition commanders and explained his strategy in simple terms that made terrible sense, and he said that the Kreenoth could not be reasoned with, so they had to be eliminated completely. Lieutenant Price added that leaving survivors would only allow the enemy to regroup and attack again, because the Krynoth were not fighting for resources or territory, and they were fighting for survival and would never stop until they were extinct. Vekthar understood the logic, but it went against everything he had learned in 300 years of military service because civilized species did not commit genocide even against monsters, like the Krynoth. But the humans had a different perspective, and they said that allowing the Krynoth to survive would be condemning billions of innocent people to death in future attacks, and that was the greater evil compared to wiping out one hostile species. Ambassador Morgan explained that Earth had learned hard lessons about the cost of mercy toward enemies who would never reciprocate, and she told Vekthar about something called World War II, when humans had fought against absolute evil. She said that humanity had tried negotiation and appeasement and diplomacy with enemies who viewed kindness as weakness, and those enemies had nearly destroyed civilization before they were finally stopped by overwhelming force. The humans had learned that some threats could not be reformed or rehabilitated or negotiated with, and sometimes the only moral choice was complete destruction of the enemy before they could harm innocent people. Vekthar wanted to argue, but he had seen what the Krynoth did to civilians, and he had watched them consume sentient beings to fuel their war machine, and he could not defend a species that was fundamentally incompatible with civilization. The Krynoth Queen vessel appeared from deep space, and it was even larger than the command ship had been, and it broadcast surrender terms offering biological tributes and promising to return to hibernation if the coalition would spare them. Vekthar prepared to accept the surrender because that was protocol. And that was what civilized species did when the enemy recognized defeat and offered reasonable terms to end hostilities. But Captain Hamilton's response came before Vekthar could transmit acceptance, and the human captain's words were cold and final, and they carried the weight of thousands of years of brutal history. He said that the Krynoth had targeted civilians and consumed sentient beings and violated every principle of warfare, and they did not deserve surrender, and they deserved extinction, and nothing less would be acceptable. The human fleet opened fire on the Queen vessel without waiting for coalition approval, and nuclear weapons blossomed like deadly flowers across the massive bioship's hull, and it screamed across every frequency as it died. Vekthar watched in silence as the last Krynoth command structure was annihilated, and the remaining bioships began fleeing in all directions, and the human vessels pursued them with mechanical efficiency. Lieutenant Price coordinated the pursuit and tracked every fleeing ship and every escape pod, and every biological fragment that might be capable of regeneration, and the humans hunted them all down without mercy. They did not stop until every single Krynoth vessel was destroyed, and every trace of the species in this sector was eliminated, and they had committed genocide with surgical precision and absolute certainty of purpose. The coalition fleet hung back and watched as humanity demonstrated what total war really meant, and Vekthar felt something break inside himself because he had believed that civilization meant rising above such brutality. But the humans had saved New Carthage and protected billions of lives and stopped a threat that the coalition's civilized warfare could not handle, and the cost was written in ash and nuclear fire across the star system. Ambassador Morgan contacted Vekthar privately after the battle ended, and she said that she understood what he was feeling, and that humans struggled with these same moral questions every time they were forced to unleash their capacity for destruction. She explained that Earth did not celebrate what they had done, and there would be no parades or medals for the warriors who fought at New Carthage because humans understood the terrible cost of total war, even when it was necessary. General Patricia Blake appeared on the communication screen, and she was an older woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much, and she carried herself with the authority of someone who had made impossible choices. She told Vekthar that humanity did not want to be the galaxy's executioner, but they would accept that role if it meant protecting innocent lives and preserving civilization against threats that could not be reasoned with. Vekthar asked how humans could live with themselves after committing genocide, and General Blake was silent for a long moment before answering that they lived with it the same way they lived with all their terrible history. She said that humans remembered and they mourned and they tried to be better, and they hoped that someday the galaxy would not need their particular brand of brutal warfare. But until that day came, they would do what was necessary. The Coalition Council convened an emergency session 3 days after the Battle of New Carthage, and the great chamber aboard the Eternal Dawn was filled with representatives from hundreds of species who had seen the combat footage. Ambassador Morgan stood before them, flanked by Captain Hamilton and General Blake and Lieutenant Price, and the mood in the chamber was tense because everyone had watched humans commit genocide with terrifying efficiency. Counselor Prime Tharn spoke first, and his crystalline body refracted light into rainbow patterns that betrayed his agitation, and his voice resonated like wind chimes but carried the weight of 2,000 years of accumulated wisdom. He said that the Coalition had reviewed Earth's combat performance and acknowledged their effectiveness, but pointed out that human methods violated 17 separate articles of the Galactic Warfare Convention. The use of nuclear weapons alone was grounds for immediate disqualification from Coalition membership, and the systematic extermination of the Krynoth species crossed moral lines that civilized societies had agreed never to cross. General Blake did not flinch, and her response was measured and calm, and she said with respect that the Coalition's conventions assumed the enemy shared their values, but the Krynoth clearly did not. She explained that the Krynoth would have consumed every living being on New Carthage and used their biomass to create more ships, and sometimes the only moral choice was overwhelming force to prevent greater evil. Vecthar found himself speaking before he realized what he was doing, and he said that in 3 centuries of military service he had never witnessed such destruction. And humans fought as if every battle was their last. Captain Hamilton replied that this was because it might be their last battle, and he explained that humans evolved on a planet that spent millions of years trying to kill them through ice ages and supervolcanoes and plagues. He said that humanity survived by learning a simple truth, which was that when extinction came, you fought with everything you had, or you died, and there was no middle ground and no room for half measures. Lieutenant Price added that the Coalition fought wars, but humans fought for the right to exist, and there was a fundamental difference between fighting for territory or resources and fighting for survival itself. The council chambers erupted into debate, and some species argued for immediate expulsion of humanity from all Coalition territories because they were too dangerous and too willing to cross moral boundaries. Others argued for humanity's inclusion, especially the species whose colonies bordered Krynoth space, because they had seen what happened when the Coalition's civilized warfare failed against an enemy that did not follow the rules. The arguments raged for hours while Vecthar sat in silence reviewing combat footage from New Carthage and trying to understand what he had witnessed and what it meant for the future of the galaxy. He paused on footage of Sergeant Cooper's squad defending a civilian shelter, and the 12 Marines had been outnumbered 50-1, and their ammunition was depleted, and they knew they were going to die. They fixed bayonets and charged into the Krynoth formation, and bought 3 more minutes for evacuation shuttles to launch, and all 12 Marines died, but 437 civilians survived. Vecthar had seen warriors sacrifice themselves before, but never with such absolute certainty of death and such grim determination to make that death count for something meaningful. Ambassador Morgan approached him during a recess, and she said that she knew what he was thinking and that humans were monsters and too dangerous to be allowed among civilized species. She said that he was not entirely wrong, because humans were dangerous, but they were dangerous to their enemies and not their friends, and Earth wanted to join the Coalition to protect civilization, not destroy it. Vecthar's translator struggled with a human concept she expressed, and the closest approximation was controlled ferocity for the greater good, but even that did not capture the full meaning. He said that the Coalition was being asked to trust that humans could control their capacity for destruction, and that their brutality was a choice and not their fundamental nature. General Blake interrupted and said that it was both their nature and their choice, and they were brutal when necessary. But necessity was the key word that separated humans from mindless predators. She explained that humans were not asking the Coalition to adopt their methods, and instead, they were offering to be the weapon the galaxy hoped it would never need to use. The debate resumed and continued through the night cycle and into the next day, and species took sides based on their proximity to threats and their philosophical beliefs about the nature of warfare. The Crystalline Tharn argued that accepting humanity would fundamentally change the Coalition's moral character, and set a precedent that brutal efficiency was acceptable when civilized methods failed. The insectoid Clixor, whose colonies had been ravaged by the Kreenoth decades ago, argued that moral purity meant nothing to dead civilians, and that humanity had saved billions of lives at New Carthage. Representative Lisa Morgan delivered an impassioned speech about Earth's desire to be part of something greater than itself, and how humanity had finally overcome its own destructive tendencies. She spoke about the thousands of years humans spent fighting each other, and how they nearly destroyed their planet multiple times before finally achieving unity and reaching for the stars. She said that humanity's violent history was not something they were proud of, but it had taught them lessons that other species never had to learn because they evolved in more peaceful circumstances. The speech moved many council members, but others remained skeptical, and Vecthar could not blame them because he had seen what humans were capable of when they decided something was necessary. Captain Hamilton requested permission to speak, and he told the council something that surprised everyone, including Vecthar, who had spent weeks observing the human military. He said that Earth's government had imposed strict limitations on when human forces could deploy weapons of mass destruction, and that nuclear weapons required authorization from 3 separate command authorities. He explained that humanity understood the danger they represented and had built safeguards into their military structure to prevent abuse of their destructive capabilities. Lieutenant Price added that every human military officer received extensive training in ethics and the laws of war and rules of engagement, and they took these responsibilities seriously, even when circumstances forced them to cross moral lines. Vecthar stood and addressed the council and said that he had initially opposed humanity's membership, but recent events had changed his perspective, even though he still had concerns. He said that the coalition had been fortunate that threats like the Kreenoth were rare, but if such threats became more common, then having humanity as an ally rather than an enemy was strategically necessary. He explained that civilized warfare was a luxury that only worked when both sides agreed to follow the rules, and that the galaxy needed a species willing to break those rules when facing an enemy that refused to honor them. Councillor Tharn called for a vote, and the chamber fell silent as each species representative cast their decision, and the results appeared on the massive holographic display. The vote was closer than anyone expected, but humanity's membership was approved by a narrow margin, with strict conditions attached to their military operations and oversight from coalition observers. Ambassador Morgan bowed her head and accepted the terms and thanked the council for their trust, and promised that Earth would prove worthy of the faith being placed in them. General Blake added that humanity understood they were being given a chance to prove themselves, and they would not waste it and would always prioritize the protection of innocent lives. Vecthar approached the human delegation after the session ended and looked at each of them and saw warriors, despite their different roles, and he respected them even though they frightened him. He said that he had thought he knew war, but 3 centuries of service had only taught him strategy and tactics and honor, and humans had taught him that survival sometimes required monstrosity. General Blake extended her hand in the human gesture of respect and said that humans did not enjoy war, and they were just very good at it because they had no choice. 3 weeks passed after humanity's acceptance into the coalition, and Vecthar thought the crisis was over. But he was wrong because the Kreenoth returned with a force 10 times larger than before. The first battle at New Carthage had been a test, and the swarm had been evaluating coalition defenses, and now they brought their full might against the core worlds targeting Sanctuary Prime itself. 50 billion souls lived on Sanctuary Prime, and it was the ancient heart of galactic civilization, and the center of art and culture and learning accumulated over thousands of years of peaceful cooperation. The coalition fleet assembled in defensive formation around the planet, and every available ship responded to the crisis, and Vecthar commanded the Eternal Dawn, which now carried weapons modified from human designs. He hated the necessity of using such brutal weapons, but he could not deny their effectiveness, and he understood that the galaxy had changed, and the old ways of civilized warfare might not be enough anymore. The debate over humanity's membership was still unresolved in practice because Earth's forces had been confined to their home system, awaiting final approval of the operational protocols. Councillor Prime Tharn opened a channel to Earth, and his crystalline form fractured light in patterns that showed his desperation and fear. And he made a request that would have been unthinkable a month ago. He said that the Coalition formally requested humanity's assistance in the defense of Sanctuary Prime, and acknowledged that their methods had proven insufficient against the Krynoth threat ambassador. Morgan's response came immediately, and she gave authorization to General Blake and told her to show the galaxy what humanity could do when innocent lives were at stake. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace in a formation the Coalition had never seen, and it did not follow elegant geometric patterns, but instead moved like a school of predatory fish. The EDF Armada consisted of over 300 vessels, and each one was named after a battle from human history, like Thermopylae and Stalingrad and Midway and Gettysburg and Normandy. The names meant nothing to Vecthar, but he could hear the weight they carried when humans spoke them, and he understood that each name represented a moment when humanity had faced extinction and survived. General Blake's voice boomed across all command channels and ordered Coalition forces to prioritize civilian evacuation and defensive operations, while offensive action became humanity's responsibility. She told all EDF vessels that 50 billion people were counting on them, and the rules of engagement were simple because there were none, and they were to destroy the enemy completely. Her final words were for Earth and the Coalition, and she told them to unleash hell, and those two words carried the weight of thousands of years of human warfare. What followed was not a battle but an extermination, and the humans attacked with savagery that made New Carthage look restrained by comparison. They used tactics the Coalition had never imagined, and they rammed damaged ships into enemy formations as improvised missiles and deliberately overloaded reactors to create massive explosions. They deployed experimental weapons that warped space itself and created gravitational anomalies that crushed entire squadrons of bioships and violated laws of physics that Vecthar thought were fundamental. Captain Hamilton led a squadron that tore through the Krynoth fleet's center and opened a path for Coalition evacuation ships, and his defiance absorbed damage that should have destroyed it 3 times over. Lieutenant Price commanded her own destroyer, called Righteous Fury, and she provided tactical updates to Vecthar with a voice that never wavered, even as she ordered attacks that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The ground commander was Colonel Pete Carter, and when Krynoth dropped, pods breached Sanctuary Prime's orbital defenses. He coordinated with planetary forces to create a massive killing field. Every park and plaza and open space was seeded with hidden explosive charges, and when the Krynoth deployed expecting easy prey, the humans detonated the entire city. Millions of tons of infrastructure collapsed directly onto Krynoth landing zones, and it was barbaric and horrifying, and it saved 40 billion lives. Vecthar watched civilian areas transform into weapons, and he understood that humans viewed everything as a potential tool of war, including their own cities and their own bodies. The tide began to turn when General Blake revealed humanity's final surprise, and the human fleet had been secretly deploying quantum entangled devices throughout the battlefield. At her signal, they activated simultaneously and created a cascading field that disrupted the Krynoth's organic communications, and the swarm lost cohesion, and individual ships became isolated and vulnerable. Blake's order was simple and final, and she told the fleet to show the enemy no mercy, and the human vessels fell upon the disorganized Krynoth like wolves on scattered sheep. They pursued fleeing vessels and destroyed escape pods and hunted down every last bioship until nothing remained but debris and radiation. A Krynoth Queen vessel attempted to surrender and offered biological tributes and treaties and promised to share technology if the Coalition would spare her and her remaining children. Captain Hamilton's response was the same as before, and he said that the Krynoth had targeted civilians and consumed sentient beings and violated every principle of warfare. He said they did not deserve surrender, and they deserved extinction, and the Queen vessel died in nuclear fire while screaming across every frequency. The battle lasted 17 hours, and when it ended, the Krynoth had been eradicated so completely that Coalition xenobiologists could not find enough intact DNA to properly classify the species. Vecthar stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dawn, looking at the debris field that stretched across 3 star systems, and Sanctuary Prime had survived, but the cost was written in Ash. Counselor Prime Tharn convened. An emergency session, and Ambassador Morgan stood before the council again, but this time no one questioned her or her people. Tharn announced that the coalition formally accepted Earth's membership with full understanding of what humanity truly represented and what they were capable of when unleashed. He said that humans were not peacekeepers but the weapon of last resort, and the shield that breaks, rather than bends, and the sword that falls when all else has failed. Ambassador Morgan bowed her head and accepted these terms and said that Earth would be the galaxy's shield, but also its conscience because humans understood the terrible cost of total war. She said they would never forget that cost, and would never let the coalition forget why such measures were necessary even when they succeeded. General Blake added that humanity did not enjoy war, and they would always choose peace first. But when peace failed and innocent lives were at stake, they would do what was necessary. Vekthar approached the human delegation after the session and looked at each of them and saw warriors who had saved his civilization. He said that he had thought he knew war, but 3 centuries of service had only taught him the surface, and humans had taught him that survival sometimes required monstrosity. He said that he hated that truth, but he was grateful someone understood it and was willing to carry that burden for the rest of the galaxy. General Blake extended her hand, and he took it, and felt the strength in her grip, and she said that humanity's rage was tempered by humanity's compassion. She said that without both qualities, humans would be the greatest threat the universe had ever known. But with both, they could protect civilization from threats that did not understand mercy. Captain Hamilton smiled grimly and said that humans had spent thousands of years fighting themselves and learning to control what they were before they could meet the galaxy. He said they had to master the monster within before they could be trusted with the monster without. And that was humanity's greatest achievement. Vekthar returned to his quarters and composed a classified report for Coalition military archives that would be read by officers for generations. The report's title was simple and direct, and it said, "On Human Warfare and When Civilized Restraint Fails. Unleash Humanity." The final line became doctrine and was taught to every coalition officer, and it said to pray that Earth remains our ally because the alternative is unthinkable. Earth had joined the Galactic Coalition and brought with them the capacity for absolute destruction, tempered by the wisdom to use it only when necessary. The galaxy had gained its greatest protector and its most terrifying weapon, and Vekthar hoped that future generations would never need to see humanity unleashed again. But he knew that hope was probably futile because the universe was vast and full of threats, and eventually, the coalition would face another enemy that could not be reasoned with. When that day came, humanity would be ready, and they would do what they had always done, and they would fight with everything they had to protect those who could not protect themselves. Vekthar looked out at the stars and wondered what other threats lurked in the darkness, and whether humanity's terrible gift would be enough to save them all.